Some marriages are built on a shared bank account. Ours was built on a family restaurant, and I spent 20 years assuming that meant Melissa and I were building the same thing, brick by brick, in the same direction. It took one Friday night in March to teach me that a shared last name and a shared vision are not always the same investment, and that some people only discover which one they actually signed up for when the stakes get high enough to matter. Every business, like every marriage, keeps a ledger nobody writes down on paper, who shows up before the ovens are lit, who stays after the last table cashes out, who signs the loan and who simply signs the card that comes with the flowers. Ours had looked balanced for 2 decades, right up until the night it wasn't. It was 8:12 on the evening of March the 7th when the ledger came due, in the kitchen of Marchetti's Trattoria in Ridgeview, Pennsylvania, with the Friday dinner rush in full swing, and my 74-year-old father collapsed against the walk-in cooler door. Welcome to Dad's Raw Revenge. Get comfortable, this one's going to take you somewhere. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Hit like, make sure you're subscribed. My name is Thomas Marchetti. I'm 45 years old. I run the kitchen my father built 32 years ago on a corner lot that used to be a hardware store. And on Sunday mornings, before the restaurant opens, I tend the small heirloom tomato garden behind the dumpster corral because my hands need something to do that isn't a knife or a spreadsheet. There's a particular quiet back there, even with the highway noise 2 blocks over, that I've never found anywhere else. I spent most of my marriage believing that if I just kept the restaurant running well enough, long enough, the rest of the family would eventually trust me the way my father did. I learned on a Friday night in March that trust isn't something you earn through output. It's something people decide to give you, or decide not to, regardless of how many plates you've sent out clean, regardless of how many 70-hour weeks you've logged proving yourself to people who were never actually counting. The dinner rush that night was the kind that makes a restaurant feel alive. 41 covers on the books, a 2-top waiting at the bar, the ticket printer chattering without pause. My father Sal still came in 3 nights a week, technically retired, unable to stay away, mostly parked at the past tasting sauces and telling the line cook stories they'd heard 40 times before. At 8:09 I heard a sound from the walk-in hallway that didn't belong to a kitchen, a soft, heavy thud, more felt through the floor than heard, buried under the clatter of the sauté station and the low roar of the exhaust hoods. I found my father on the ground 3 minutes later, his face pale and slack on the left side, his left hand curled uselessly against his apron, the smell of scorched garlic drifting from a pan someone had abandoned on a back burner. "Pop," I dropped to the floor beside him. "Pop, can you hear me?" His eyes found mine, aware, frightened, and his mouth worked at words that came out thick and wrong, half the sentence collapsing before it reached me. I called 911 at 8:13. The dispatcher asked me to describe his symptoms, and I heard myself saying words I never thought I'd say about my own father, facial drooping, slurred speech, left side weakness, words I only knew because a poster in the break room had drilled them into every one of us during a mandatory safety training 2 years back. The paramedics arrived at 8:21, 8 minutes that felt like 80, moving through my dining room in their bright jackets while 41 confused diners watched over their pasta, forks paused halfway to open mouths, a busser frozen mid-step with a tray of empty glasses. They loaded my father onto a gurney at 8:26, and one of them, a broad-shouldered man named Kessler, told me plainly, "Time matters a lot right now, sir. We're taking him to Ridgeview General Stroke Unit." "You should follow," I called Melissa from the parking lot, my hands shaking too badly to get the key in the ignition on the first try. "Thomas," she picked up on the second ring, background noise behind her, laughter, glasses clinking. "It's Pop. He had a stroke, Mel. They're taking him to Ridgeview General right now. I need you here." A pause, and behind it, the clink of a glass being set down carefully. "Oh my God, is he how bad? Bad enough that I need you here, Melissa." "Please, I'm coming," she said. "I just have to give me a little bit, okay? I'm coming." I believed her. That belief is the part of that night I still can't quite forgive myself for even now. Melissa called back at 9:47. I was in the stroke unit waiting room at Ridgeview General, the vending machine humming its low electrical hum, a paper cup of bad coffee cooling in my hand, when my phone lit up with her name and I felt, for 1 second, the whole night loosen its grip on my chest. "Thomas," her voice had gone careful, measured, the voice of someone reading lines she hadn't written herself. "I'm so sorry, my dad's dinner is still going, and it's the Whitmore deal dinner, the one he's been planning for months, and if I bail right now in the middle of it, it makes us both look, Melissa, my father might be dying. I know, and I feel terrible, but Dad needs me at this table for at least another hour. This deal is worth $11 million to the firm, and I can't just..." Behind her voice I heard her father, Richard Colton, saying something I couldn't make out, and Melissa's tone tightened in response, the tone of a woman following instructions rather than her own instincts. "I'll come straight after," she said. "I promise, Thomas, an hour, maybe less. He asked for you by name before they sedated him for the scan, I said. It wasn't entirely true. He tried to say her name and mine both, the syllables collapsing together into something the nurse had to ask me to translate. But I wanted Melissa to hear it as true, wanted the weight of it to move her faster than logic seemed to be managing. I'll be there, she said again, like repeating it made it truer. I have to go, Thomas, they're waiting on me. Melissa, please, I'm asking you to leave now. I heard you, she said quieter. I have to go. The line went dead. I sat in that waiting room holding a phone gone quiet, 45 years old, watching other families move through their own private emergencies around me, a young couple gripping hands near the vending machine, an elderly woman praying quietly over rosary beads 2 chairs down while my wife finished a business dinner instead. What people do at 9:58, the waiting room door opened, and Rosa Delgado walked in still wearing her Marchetti's apron. Flour dust ghosted across one forearm, having left the kitchen mid-shift to a sous chef she trusted with maybe 2 years of experience. Rosa had worked the line at Marchetti's for 11 years. She'd started as a dishwasher at 19 and worked her way to sous chef under my father's patient teaching, learning knife cuts and sauce reductions the same slow way I once had. Nobody had called her. She'd heard the ambulance called out over the kitchen radio and simply taken off her apron and walked out the back door, leaving a full station behind her without a second thought. I'm not asking what happened yet, she said, sitting down beside me without invitation. I'm asking what you need. I don't know yet, I admitted. Then I'll sit here until you do. And she did for the next 4 hours, through the CT scan and the neurologist's first assessment and the long, silent stretch after, without once checking her phone or mentioning the restaurant she'd abandoned mid-service. That's what people do, Thomas, she said when I finally thanked her for staying. When it matters, you show up first and you sort the rest out later. Anybody who tells you different is telling you something about themselves, not about how it's supposed to work. She said it without heat, without making it about anyone in particular, just laying the sentence down like a fact of the world she'd long ago stopped being surprised by. Somewhere around midnight, Rosa went down to the cafeteria and came back with 2 vending machine sandwiches nobody had asked her to buy, because she'd decided correctly that neither of us had eaten since noon. When my father was finally settled in a room and Rosa had to leave for her own early shift the next morning, she squeezed my shoulder once at the elevator and said, "Call me if anything changes, doesn't matter the hour," and I believed her completely, the way I hadn't quite managed to believe my own wife 4 hours earlier. If this story's hitting close to home already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now so you don't miss where this one ends up. Trust me, it's worth the ride. My father's neurologist, Dr. Anthony Whitfield, found me at 11:40 that night with the kind of composed, practiced calm I would come to be grateful for over the following days. "Your father had an ischemic stroke, moderate severity," he said. "We caught it inside the window for the clot-dissolving medication, which matters enormously. The 12 minutes you noted between the fall and the 911 call likely made the difference in how much function he recovers. He'll need inpatient rehab for probably 3 to 4 weeks, then outpatient therapy after that. Speech, some right side sorry, left side weakness. We'll know more as the swelling resolves. Will he be able to come back to the restaurant? In some capacity, likely in time. Not driving for a while, not standing a full shift for months. He's going to need consistent support and probably some hard conversations about how much of the day-to-day he keeps doing going forward." Dr. Whitfield paused, studying me for a moment. "Is there someone at home who can help manage his care once he's discharged? Family support matters enormously in recovery outcomes at his age." "It'll be me," I said, "whatever it takes." I told him I understood the rest. I did not tell him that the person who should have been standing beside me hearing all of it had chosen an $11 million dinner instead. Some things you carry alone until you're ready to set them down. Melissa arrived at 1:15 in the morning, 4 hours and 49 minutes after the call, in the same cocktail dress she'd worn to the Whitmore dinner, her makeup still camera-ready, heels clicking sharp against the hospital linoleum. She hugged me stiffly in the hallway and said, "I'm so sorry, Thomas. It was just Dad really needed me at that table. You know how important this deal is to him." I looked at my wife's face in that fluorescent hallway and saw, clearly for the first time, a woman who had learned to apologize for choices without ever reconsidering them. My father came home from the hospital 9 days later, transferred straight to Ridgeview Rehabilitation Center for inpatient therapy, and I spent those 9 days running the restaurant during the day and driving to the hospital every night after close, still in my chef's whites most nights, too tired to change first. Melissa called each evening, brief calls, always ending the same way. "Tell your dad I'm thinking about him. I'll come by this weekend once things calm down." Things never quite calmed down. There was always another closing at her father's firm, another dinner, another reason the weekend visit slid to the next one. I didn't push. I told myself grief and worry make people strange, that Melissa loved my father in her own way even if it didn't look like showing up, that she would come around once the shock of it wore off. I believed my own patience was a virtue. It took Richard's study to show me it had actually just been blindness. Looking back now, I can trace the shift in her voice across those 9 phone calls, evening by evening. How "I'll come by this weekend" slowly, almost imperceptibly, turned into "we should talk about the restaurant soon." A sentence I heard 3 separate times before I understood what it was actually building toward. It was 5 days later, in Richard Colton's home office, that I understood the $11 million dinner had never been the whole story. Melissa asked me to come by on a Wednesday evening, and I found not just her but her father and her brother Brandon waiting at the conference table Richard kept in his study for exactly this kind of ambush. "Thomas," Richard began, his tone the same tone he used closing real estate deals, warm and immovable at once. "With Sal out of commission for the foreseeable future, we think it's time to talk seriously about restaurant leadership. Brandon's got the MBA, he's run operations for 3 of my properties, and frankly, someone needs to be making the business decisions while you're focused on caregiving and the kitchen." "I've run that kitchen and that business for 10 years, Richard." "You've run the kitchen," Brandon said. "There's a difference and you know it. I've also run payroll, vendor contracts, the lease renegotiation, and every hire in that building for a decade, Brandon. That's not just a kitchen." Brandon waved a hand like the distinction bored him. Richard leaned back in his chair, unbothered, the posture of a man who has already decided how this conversation ends. I turned to Melissa, waiting for her to say something, anything, in my direction. She folded her hands on the table the way she does when she's already decided something and is only performing the deliberation. "Thomas, my father's loan is what got the second dining room built 8 years ago. That's not nothing. I think, given everything going on with Sal, it makes sense for Brandon to step in on the business side, at least temporarily, while you focus on Pop in the kitchen. That's not protecting the restaurant, Melissa. That's taking it. Here's the line I will remember for the rest of my life, delivered as flat and certain as a closing statement. This isn't personal, Thomas, it's just good business. Somebody has to think clearly right now, and it isn't going to be you." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't stand up. I sat very still, the way a man sits still when he watches a door close from the inside, and I said, "I think I need to go check on my father now." My father's younger brother Carmine had spent 26 years as a small business bankruptcy attorney before he retired, and if there's one man whose steadiness I've spent my whole life failing to fully copy, it's him. I drove out to his place on the edge of town that weekend and told him everything: the stroke, the dinner, the study, the words "good business." He listened without interrupting, the way he always has, and when I finished he poured us both bourbon and sat with me on his porch for a long, quiet minute. "What do you need?" he finally asked. 4 words, no lecture, no outrage performed on my behalf. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "I just know I'm not signing anything Richard Colton puts in front of me without understanding exactly what he actually owns." "Then don't sign a thing," Carmine said. "Find out what he actually owns first. People don't move this fast on a loan from 8 years ago unless they think there's real leverage in it. Find out if there actually is." "You spent 26 years watching families fight over exactly this kind of thing," I said. "Does it ever stop surprising you?" He turned his glass slowly on the porch rail, considering. "Never once. What I did learn is that the families who came out the other side intact weren't the ones who yelled the loudest or hired the meanest lawyer. They were the ones who stopped guessing and started checking. A fact, stated plainly and proven on paper, does more work in one afternoon than a year of arguing ever will. It was as close to a plan as my uncle was ever going to hand me, and it turned out to be exactly enough. It took me 2 weeks of careful, quiet work to find out, and most of what mattered had been sitting in my father's own filing cabinet, in a folder labeled in his handwriting, the entire time. In 2018, when Richard's loan funded the second dining room, my father had structured it on the advice of his own attorney, a man named Otis Pruitt, who'd since retired to Florida not as an equity stake, but as a straight loan with a profit-sharing repayment schedule, capped at a fixed return, with full satisfaction and reversion of any claim once the principal plus 20% was repaid. My father had insisted on that structure specifically, Pruitt would later tell me, because he didn't want anyone, family included, holding a permanent thumb on the scale of a restaurant he intended to leave clean to whoever earned it. According to the restaurant's own accounting records, that loan had been fully repaid, principal and interest both, in October of 2023, 17 months before Sal's stroke. Richard Colton owned nothing. He hadn't owned anything for a year and 5 months. Every word in that study had been leverage built on a claim that had already expired, and either Richard knew that and gambled I wouldn't check, or he genuinely hadn't looked closely enough at his own paperwork to notice his own son-in-law's business had quietly paid him off in full 2 years of careful bookkeeping, rendering his entire study performance obsolete before he'd even staged it. I spent an afternoon confirming every number before I trusted it enough to act on it. A call to the restaurant's accountant, a woman named Priya Sandhu who had handled Marchetti's books for 11 years, confirmed the final repayment transaction. $214,000 wired on October 3, 2023, closing out the loan at principal plus the agreed 20%. A second call to Otis Prout himself, retired but sharp as ever on the phone from his condo in Sarasota. Confirmed he'd drafted the original agreement specifically as a loan rather than equity because Sal didn't want to owe anybody a say in his own kitchen, not even family. I called Carmine's old colleague, an attorney named Denise Ackafer who still practiced in town, and had her confirm it all in writing dated documentation. The loan satisfaction letter Prout had filed back in 2023. A clean paper trail with nothing left to argue. You understand, Denise said, sliding the folder back across her desk. You don't owe anyone in that family an explanation for a debt that's already settled. I know, I said, but some people only believe what's typed on letterhead. I'd rather she read it than argue with me about it. My father was 3 weeks into inpatient rehab by the time I visited him with the folder, his speech slower than before but returning steadily, word by careful word, his left hand regaining grip strength one exercise at a time under a therapist's patient counting. I sat beside his bed and told him everything: the study, the ambush, the words Melissa had used. Salvatore Marchetti, I said, using his full name the way I only do when something is serious. I'm not going to let them take the thing you spent 32 years building because Melissa decided it was good business. He was quiet a long moment, his good hand finding mine on the blanket. Say the list, he said, his words still coming slower than before but clear, out loud, everything. So I did, sitting there in that rehab room with the therapy schedule taped to the whiteboard behind him, the dinner Melissa hadn't left. The 4 hours and 49 minutes, the words good business spoken like a verdict. The study meeting sprung on me without warning, 3 against 1. The 8 days since where she'd called Brandon the business side instead of an intruder. The 9 days of I'll come by this weekend that never once turned into a weekend. That's the ledger, I said. That's the whole thing, plain as I can make it. I paused and added the last entry, the one sitting heaviest under all the others. And underneath every one of those is the same sentence. This isn't personal, it's just good business. As if anyone had asked her to make it personal. As if taking your restaurant from a man 3 weeks out of a stroke was ever going to read as anything else. My father squeezed my hand, his grip weaker than it used to be but entirely certain. Then you know what comes next. Melissa's family held a standing Sunday dinner at Richard's house, and 2 weeks after the study ambush, Brandon had already started showing up at the restaurant twice a week, reviewing invoices, asking my managers questions that weren't his to ask, once even suggesting to Rosa that scheduling might look different soon. I let it happen without argument because I wanted every one of them in the same room, at the same table. When the truth finally landed, I brought the folder to that Sunday dinner, set it on the passenger seat of my truck like it might slide off if I wasn't careful with it, and drove the 15 minutes to Richard's house, turning the conversation over in my head one more time, not to rehearse anger, just to make sure I said it plainly. Melissa saw the folder the moment I set it beside my plate and something crossed her face, not quite alarm yet, just the flicker of a woman recalculating whether this evening was going to go the way she'd planned. We ate. Richard talked about a new property acquisition, some strip mall outside Harrisburg. Brandon mentioned, with a little too much confidence, some scheduling changes he was considering for the kitchen staff, changes that would have gutted Rosa's hours by a third. I let him finish. I want to say something, I said once the plates were cleared, and I want to say it once calmly so we can all see the same facts at the same time. I opened the folder and slid the first document across to Richard. He didn't pick it up right away. This is the original 2018 loan agreement for the second dining room. It was never an equity stake. It was a loan, structured with a fixed profit-sharing repayment and a satisfaction clause on your own attorney's advice at the time. I slid the second document beside it. This is the satisfaction letter, filed in October of 2023. Principal and 20% interest, paid in full, 17 months before Pop's stroke. You haven't held any claim on this business in almost a year and a half, Richard. The room had gone very quiet. Richard picked up the letter at last, his eyes moving fast across it, then slower, the posture of a man watching a foundation. He'd built his whole argument on turnout to have been poured somewhere else entirely. His fingers tightened slightly on the paper. He set it down, picked it back up, read the satisfaction date again as though it might change on a second pass. "This can't be right," he said, though his voice had already lost the certainty it carried in his study 2 weeks earlier. "Call Otis Prout yourself if you'd like," I said, "or call Denise Acaffer, whose letter is stapled to the back. Either one will confirm it. I'd also welcome you to check with your own accountant, since I'm sure the wire transfer is still sitting in your firm's records from October of 2023. Brandon reached for the document like he might find a different answer buried in it than his father had. His face moved from confidence to confusion to something closer to embarrassment, the look of a man realizing he'd been reviewing invoices at a restaurant he had never actually had any claim to touch, threatening a kitchen staff's hours over a debt that had ceased to exist a year and a half before he ever set foot in it. Melissa hadn't said a word. She was staring at the satisfaction letter the way you stare at a math problem you're certain you've solved correctly, right up until someone shows you the answer key. I turned to her last. "You called it good business, Melissa, taking a restaurant my father built from a man recovering from a stroke, based on a debt that had already been paid off for a year and a half. You didn't check. You just decided, and you let your father and your brother build a case on a fact you never bothered to verify, while I sat in a hospital hallway alone at 9:47 at night." Melissa didn't storm out. She sat very still, the way I'd sat still in that study 2 weeks before, and when she finally spoke, her voice had lost every bit of the composure she'd worn walking in. "I thought I was being practical," she said. "I thought somebody needed to think about the business side while everything with your dad was falling apart, and I let my father convince me that meant stepping back from you instead of standing beside you." "They needed me standing beside my father in that waiting room," I said. "That's what the night needed. Everything else was a fiction your father built because it was convenient, and instead of checking it, you carried it into my family's restaurant." Nobody applauded, nobody shouted. The consequence when it came was quieter than that. "I'll have my attorney send a formal acknowledgement this week," Richard said finally, not quite meeting my eyes, folding the letter along its original crease with unnecessary care. "There's no further claim, I understand that." Brandon stopped showing up at the restaurant that same week, his invoice reviews and schedule considerations evaporating without another word about them. Richard sent a brief, clipped email acknowledging the loan's satisfaction 2 days later, and did not raise the subject again in any conversation I was party to. Melissa agreed that same night to weekly counseling, no conditions, the therapist's name written on the back of a business card by the time dessert would have been served. "I want to understand why I believed him over you," she said quietly, once her father and brother had gone quiet at the far end of the table. "Not because anyone's making me. Because I don't like who I was in that study, and I'd like to stop being her." Rosa, when I told her at the restaurant the next morning, just nodded once, the way two people nod when they both already understand exactly what happened and don't need to discuss it further, and went back to prepping the sauce for the day, one hand briefly resting on my shoulder as she passed. "It's June now. My father is back at the restaurant 3 afternoons a week, slower than before, his left hand still catching up to his right, but present, still tasting sauces, still telling the line cook stories they've heard 50 times now instead of 40. Brandon hasn't set foot in the kitchen since March. Melissa comes to therapy every Tuesday, and last week, unprompted, she thanked me for handling it with documents instead of a shouting match at her father's table. I told her the truth. I never wanted to win an argument with her family. I wanted my father's restaurant left alone, and the only way to guarantee that was to make sure the facts were too plain for anyone to keep arguing against. Some evenings after close, I sit out back among the tomato plants and think about how close we came to letting 4 hours and 49 minutes become the shape of the rest of our marriage, simply because I'd spent 20 years believing that love that shows up eventually is the same as love that shows up on time. Uncle Carmine was right about the only thing that mattered in the end. People don't grab this hard at something unless they believe there's real leverage underneath it. The only question is whether you're willing to go find out if the leverage is actually real, or just a story someone told confidently enough that everyone stopped checking. My father tastes the marinara every afternoon now, same as always, though it takes him a beat longer to find the word for what it's missing. Rosa runs the past 3 nights a week without me looking over her shoulder, because I trust her the way my father once had to learn to trust me. And every Sunday, Melissa and I eat dinner at our own table now, not her father's, just the two of us, working slowly back toward whatever this marriage is going to be once it's finished being rebuilt. A family's ledger doesn't balance itself, and it doesn't forgive silently either. It balances because somebody, eventually, sets it down on the table in the light and says, "Here is what was owed, here is what was already paid, and here is what we do now that everyone can finally see it clearly." That's as true of a marriage as it is of a business, and I don't think I fully understood that until I had to prove it, document by document, at my father-in-law's own dinner table. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment below. Let me know where you're watching from. I'll see you on the next one.